The morning sun barely peeked through the airport windows as Elaine Johnson dragged her carry-on through Terminal C. She checked her watch, 5:45 a.m., just enough time to grab a coffee before boarding. The early flight to Chicago wasn't her first choice, but as the newly appointed CEO of Horizon Airlines, she had a job to do that couldn't wait. "Black coffee, please. Large," she told the barista at the airport cafe. The young man behind the counter nodded sleepily. Elaine understood how he felt. Her own eyes were heavy from staying up late reviewing company reports. The board meeting yesterday had lasted until 9 p.m., and she'd gone home only to pack an overnight bag before catching a few hours of sleep. Elaine took a long sip of her coffee and glanced down at her outfit: worn jeans, comfortable sneakers, and a simple gray sweater. Not her usual power suit, but that was the point. Today she wasn't traveling as the CEO, she was just another passenger in economy class. "The only way to truly know how our customers feel is to become one," she had told the board when proposing her undercover evaluation program. Some had laughed, calling it unnecessary. "We have customer surveys for that," one board member had said. But Elaine knew better. 23 years in the airline industry had taught her that numbers on a page couldn't capture the full customer experience. The boarding announcement for Flight 862 to Chicago crackled over the speakers. Elaine finished her coffee, tossed the cup in the recycling bin, and headed toward the gate. She joined the line for Group 4 boarding, far from the priority lane she could have used with her executive status. A young mother with a fussy toddler stood in front of her, looking stressed as she juggled a diaper bag and a stuffed animal, while trying to keep her child from wandering off. Elaine smiled at her. "Need a hand with anything?" The woman looked up, surprised by the offer. "Could you hold Mr. Bunny for a second? I need to find our boarding passes." Elaine took the well-loved stuffed rabbit while the woman searched through her bag. The toddler eyed Elaine suspiciously, before deciding she seemed trustworthy enough to hold the precious toy. "First time flying with your little one?" Elaine asked. "Is it that obvious?" The woman laughed nervously. "We're visiting my mom in Chicago. She hasn't met her granddaughter yet." "She's going to be thrilled," Elaine said, handing back the stuffed animal as the line began moving forward. "If you need anything during the flight, don't hesitate to ask for help. That's what the crew is there for." The woman nodded gratefully as they shuffled toward the boarding gate. On the jetway, Elaine took a deep breath. This was the beginning of her secret mission, Operation Customer Experience, as she'd labeled it in her private notes. The board had given her 6 months to turn around Horizon's slipping customer satisfaction scores before shareholders started demanding more drastic measures. As she stepped onto the plane, Elaine was greeted by a flight attendant with a practiced smile. "Welcome aboard," the woman said mechanically, not making eye contact as she continued greeting the stream of passengers. Elaine made her way down the narrow aisle to seat 24B, a middle seat in economy. Not the most comfortable spot, but perfect for her purpose. She stowed her small bag in the overhead compartment and settled in, pulling out a paperback novel rather than the company reports she'd normally be reviewing. Her seatmates arrived shortly after, an older gentleman by the window who immediately put on headphones, and a college-aged student on the aisle who was already typing rapidly on a laptop despite the plane not having taken off yet. As more passengers boarded, Elaine observed the crew. There were 4 flight attendants working the economy cabin. 3 seemed efficient if somewhat detached, going through safety procedures with the bored precision of people who had done this thousands of times. But the 4th, a woman with pin-straight blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, caught Elaine's attention. Her name tag read Kelly, and unlike her colleagues, she seemed to be making an effort to connect with passengers, remembering to smile and making small talk as she helped people find their seats. That's the kind of service we need more of, Elaine thought, making a mental note. Good customer service wasn't just about efficiency. It was about making people feel seen and valued. The captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming everyone aboard and announcing their flight time to Chicago. 2 hours and 45 minutes. As the plane began taxiing, Elaine settled deeper into her seat and prepared for takeoff. She hadn't told anyone about this trip. Not her assistant, not the Chicago office expecting her tomorrow, and certainly not the flight crew. As far as anyone knew, she was just another passenger. It was better this way. People behaved differently when they knew they were being watched, and Elaine wanted to see the unfiltered reality of her airline service. The plane accelerated down the runway and lifted into the air. Through the window beyond her seatmate, Elaine caught glimpses of the city shrinking below them, the early morning sun painting everything in soft gold. Despite her exhaustion, she felt a flutter of excitement. This wasn't just a flight. It was the beginning of her plan to transform Horizon Airlines from the inside out. As they reached cruising altitude, Elaine opened her novel but found herself unable to focus on the words. Instead, her mind wandered to the challenge ahead. Horizon had once been an industry leader in customer satisfaction, but in recent years, cost-cutting measures and an aging fleet had damaged their reputation. Complaints were up 30% from last year. Employee morale was at an all-time low. Something needed to change, and fast. The seatbelt sign dinged off and the cabin crew began preparing for beverage service. Elaine watched as they moved methodically down the aisle. The flight attendant named Kelly was working the front section, still maintaining her friendly demeanor despite a passenger who was clearly being difficult about his drink order. About an hour into the flight, Elaine felt a chill. The air conditioning was blasting directly overhead, and she'd forgotten to pack a sweater in her carry-on. She pressed the call button, something she rarely did as a frequent flyer who prided herself on self-sufficiency. A different flight attendant approached, not Kelly, but a woman with dark hair and a name tag that read Melissa. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes as she leaned toward Elaine's seat. "How can I help you?" she asked, her tone professional but distant. "Could I get a blanket, please? It's quite cold in here," Elaine said. The flight attendant's eyes flickered briefly over Elaine's casual clothes. Something in her expression changed, subtle, but noticeable to someone like Elaine who had spent decades reading people in business negotiations. "We offer complimentary blankets in business class," Melissa said. "In economy, they're available for purchase at $8. "I see," Elaine said, reaching for her wallet. "I'll take one then." As Melissa walked away to fetch the blanket, Elaine couldn't help but notice how differently she interacted with the passengers across the aisle. A well-dressed couple who looked like they were traveling for business. Her smile was warmer, her posture more attentive. Interesting, Elaine thought. Was this a one-off or was it part of a pattern? She would need more data before drawing conclusions. When Melissa returned with the blanket, Elaine handed over her credit card and asked, "Has Horizon always charged for blankets in economy?" "No," Melissa said as she processed the payment. "It's a new policy from management trying to boost ancillary revenue, I guess." She handed back Elaine's card with a slight frown. "Between you and me, it's just one more way they're cutting corners these days. Not that anyone up top cares what passengers think." "If only you knew," Elaine thought as she accepted the blanket. This was exactly the kind of insight she was looking for. The unfiltered perspective of frontline staff who dealt with customers day in and day out. As Melissa moved on to the next row, Elaine wrapped the thin blanket around her shoulders and resumed her observations. The young mother she'd met during boarding was struggling to calm her fussy toddler a few rows ahead. Elaine watched as Kelly, the friendly flight attendant, stopped by their seats and knelt down, producing a small packet of animal crackers from her pocket and offering them to the child with a conspiratorial wink to the grateful mother. Such a simple gesture, Elaine thought, but one that probably made all the difference to that frazzled parent's journey. That was the essence of good service, anticipating needs before they became problems. The contrast between the two flight attendants was striking, and it made Elaine wonder about training, morale, and leadership within her company. Were some staff naturally better at customer service, or was it a matter of motivation and proper guidance? As the new CEO, these were the questions she needed to answer. Outside the window, fluffy white clouds drifted by against a brilliant blue sky. Elaine closed her book and leaned back, contemplating the journey ahead. Not just to Chicago, but the longer path to transforming Horizon Airlines back into a company known for exceptional customer care. It wouldn't be easy, but sitting here incognito, experiencing her airline as a regular customer, she knew she was on the right track. Little did she know. The most revealing part of her undercover journey was yet to come. The beverage cart rumbled down the narrow aisle, stopping. At each row, as Melissa mechanically asked, "Something to drink?" Her colleague Kelly was working the other aisle, chatting easily with passengers and remembering their names. Elaine watched the difference between them with growing interest. When the cart reached her row, Melissa barely made eye contact as she asked, "Beverage? Just water, please," Elaine replied with a smile, trying to engage. "How long have you been flying with Horizon?" Melissa glanced up briefly while pouring the water. 8 years. Do you enjoy it?" A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, crossed Melissa's face. "It pays the bills." She handed over the plastic cup and moved on without further comment, leaving Elaine to wonder what had happened to someone who'd chosen a service career, but seemed to dislike serving people. The businessman across the aisle ordered a gin and tonic, and Elaine noticed how Melissa's demeanor shifted, her voice warmer, her movements more graceful as she mixed his drink with a splash of lime. "Flying to Chicago for business?" Melissa asked him. "Yes, big meeting tomorrow," the man replied, straightening his tie. "Well, you'll certainly look the part," Melissa said with a smile that hadn't been offered to Elaine. "First time in Chicago?" "No, I go monthly. My company has an office there." "How nice. Let me know if you need anything else." Elaine sipped her water thoughtfully. The contrast was undeniable now. Melissa was perfectly capable of providing good service when she wanted to, just apparently not to everyone. About halfway through the flight, the college student next to Elaine got up to use the restroom. While he was gone, Elaine overheard a conversation between Melissa and another flight attendant at the galley just behind their row. "God, I can't wait for this flight to be over," Melissa muttered, just loud enough for Elaine to hear. "Economy passengers are the worst, always wanting something for nothing." "Not all of them," the other attendant replied. "Some are nice." "Yeah, well, not the ones in my section." "Did you see that woman in 24B asking for a blanket? Wearing those beat-up sneakers and acting like she's at a hotel." Elaine felt her cheeks warm but kept her eyes fixed on her book, pretending not to hear. "I mean, look at her," Melissa continued, lowering her voice slightly but not enough. "Doesn't look like she could afford business class anyway. Probably used miles for this ticket." The other flight attendant laughed uncomfortably. "Come on, Mel, that's not fair. You don't know her situation. Trust me, I've been doing this long enough to spot the types. The ones who belong in business class and the ones who don't." An older woman sitting across from Elaine glanced over with a sympathetic look, clearly having overheard as well. She gave Elaine a small apologetic smile as if to say, "I'm sorry you have to hear this." But no one spoke up. Elaine took a deep breath, fighting the impulse to stand up and introduce herself as the new CEO. That would defeat the purpose of her undercover mission. Besides, this moment was incredibly valuable. A raw glimpse into the attitudes that might be affecting customer experience across the airline. The college student returned to his seat, and Elaine tried to refocus on her book, but the words swam on the page. She'd known there were issues with customer service at Horizon. The surveys and complaint data made that clear, but experiencing it firsthand was different. It wasn't just about procedures or policies. It was about a culture that somehow allowed employees to judge customers based on appearance. As a black woman who had climbed to the top of a predominantly white and male industry, Elaine was no stranger to being underestimated or judged by her appearance. Early in her career, she'd been mistaken for a secretary or assistant countless times. Even after becoming a senior executive at her previous airline, she'd occasionally been directed to economy check-in when traveling for business, despite holding a first-class ticket. But this wasn't about her personal feelings. It was about Horizon and the experience of every passenger who boarded their planes. If flight attendants were openly mocking customers, even ones they thought couldn't hear them, what did that say about the company culture? A bout of turbulence shook the plane, causing the overhead bins to rattle. The captain's voice came over the intercom, asking flight attendants to take their seats. Elaine glanced out the window at dark clouds gathering below them. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're expecting some rough air for the next 15 to 20 minutes, the captain announced. "Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened." The plane dipped suddenly, eliciting gasps from several passengers. The young mother with the toddler looked particularly anxious, clutching her child tightly as the plane bounced through the air pocket. Elaine had flown through enough turbulence in her life to know this was relatively mild, but she could see the fear on some passengers' faces. This was another moment where good service mattered, helping nervous flyers feel safe and cared for during stressful situations. Kelly, The friendly flight attendant was making her way back to her jump seat when she paused by the young mother's row. Even from several rows away, Elaine could see her crouch down briefly, say something reassuring, and give the toddler a gentle pat on the head before continuing on. The mother visibly relaxed. Melissa, meanwhile, strapped herself into her jump seat without a glance at any of the passengers in her section, pulling out her phone to check it one last time before turning it off. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. Same job, same training, presumably the same pay, but worlds apart in attitude and approach. As the plane continued to bounce through the turbulence, Elaine's mind raced with thoughts about what she could do to address these issues. Better training was an obvious start, but training alone couldn't create empathy. There needed to be a shift in culture, in hiring practices, in how performance was measured and rewarded. The turbulence gradually eased, and the seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers began to stir, some heading to the restrooms, others stretching in the limited space of their seats. Elaine decided to take a walk to stretch her legs. As she moved toward the back of the plane, she passed Kelly, who was helping an elderly passenger adjust his reading light. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" Kelly asked. "No, thank you, dear. You've been very kind," the elderly man replied with a grateful smile. Kelly noticed Elaine waiting to pass and stepped aside with a friendly nod. "Can I help you with something?" "Just stretching my legs," Elaine said. "Long flight. Of course. We should be starting our descent in about 40 minutes. Let me know if you need anything." Such a small interaction, but it reinforced what Elaine had been observing throughout the flight. Kelly made passengers feel valued with minimal effort, just genuine attention and basic courtesy. Elaine made her way back to her seat, more determined than ever to understand what was happening at her airline. Was Melissa an outlier, or were there others like her throughout the company? Was Kelly the exception or the rule? And what factors in the company culture were shaping these different approaches to service? Back in her seat, Elaine pulled out her phone and opened the Notes app. Under the guise of writing a personal memo, she began jotting down observations and ideas. By the time the captain announced their initial descent into Chicago, she had filled several pages with thoughts about customer service improvements, cultural change initiatives, and potential training programs. The flight attendants made a final pass through the cabin, collecting trash and checking that seatbelts were fastened. When Melissa reached Elaine's row, she barely glanced at her as she held open the trash bag. "Any garbage?" Elaine handed over her empty water cup. "Thank you. By the way, could you tell me something about the airline's new customer service initiatives? I heard there were some changes coming." The question was deliberately leading. There were indeed new programs in development, though they hadn't been announced yet. As CEO, Elaine was curious how much frontline staff knew or cared about upcoming company changes. Melissa's expression flickered with surprise, then slight suspicion. "I don't know what you're talking about. Where did you hear that?" "I read something online about Horizon improving their customer experience," Elaine improvised. "I fly often, so I was curious." Melissa's posture stiffened. "Well, they don't tell us much. Corporate makes decisions, and we just have to deal with them." She lowered her voice slightly. "I don't think someone like you needs to worry about corporate policies anyway." There it was again, that dismissive tone. The subtle implication that Elaine, in her casual clothes, wasn't important enough to merit information or respect. "Someone like me?" Elaine repeated carefully, her voice level. Melissa seemed to realize she'd crossed a line. "I just mean regular passengers don't usually ask about corporate policies," she said quickly, backpedaling. "If you're interested in updates, you can check the website." She moved on quickly to the next row, leaving Elaine with a bitter taste in her mouth but also valuable confirmation of what she'd suspected. There was a clear disconnect between corporate headquarters and the front line. Staff, an us versus them mentality that was affecting how employees interacted with customers. The plane began its final approach into Chicago, the city skyline emerging through breaks in the clouds. Elaine put away her notes and prepared for landing, her mind already mapping out the changes she would need to make. This flight had been more revealing than any report or survey could ever be. As the wheels touched down at O'Hare International Airport, Elaine knew her real work was just beginning. The next few hours would be crucial, not just for her personally, but for the future of Horizon Airlines. The plane taxied to the gate, and the familiar chorus of unbuckling seatbelts filled the cabin, before the captain had even turned off the fasten seatbelt sign. Elaine remained seated, watching as passengers rushed to grab their belongings from the overhead bins, creating the usual bottleneck in the aisles. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived at Chicago O'Hare International Airport," the lead flight attendant announced over the intercom. "Local time is 9:35 a.m. and the temperature is 65 degrees. On behalf of Captain Reynolds and the entire crew, thank you for flying with Horizon Airlines today." Elaine noticed how the announcement felt rehearsed and impersonal, another missed opportunity to make passengers feel valued. At her previous airline, she'd encouraged flight crews to personalize their announcements, maybe mentioning a local event in the destination city or wishing luck to sports fans if a big game was happening. Small touches, but they helped create a sense of connection. As the deplaning process began, Elaine stayed in her seat, letting others go ahead while she continued making mental notes. She watched as Kelly, the friendly flight attendant, stood at the front of the economy section, thanking each passenger and wishing them a pleasant stay in Chicago. Melissa was at the very front of the plane, her goodbye smiles noticeably warmer for the business class passengers than for those coming from economy. Finally, when most passengers had deplaned, Elaine gathered her things and made her way toward the exit. She paused momentarily at the front of the plane, making eye contact with Melissa. "Thank you for the flight," Elaine said pleasantly. Melissa gave a perfunctory nod, already looking past her to the next passenger. Elaine took a step closer and lowered her voice. "Actually, I wanted to ask you something about your comment earlier." Melissa's eyes snapped back to Elaine, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. "Excuse me? You said someone like me doesn't need to worry about corporate policies. I'm curious what you meant by that." The color drained slightly from Melissa's face as she realized Elaine had taken offense. "I didn't mean anything by it," she said quickly. "It's just that most passengers don't ask about company policies." "I see." Elaine reached into her bag and pulled out a business card, handing it to Melissa. "Well, as the new CEO of Horizon Airlines, I actually worry about our corporate policies quite a bit." Melissa stared at the card in her hand, her mouth opening slightly as the implications sank in. You're," she stammered, looking back at Elaine with wide eyes, taking in her casual clothes with new understanding. By now, the other flight attendants had noticed something happening. Kelly stepped closer, concern evident on her face, while the lead flight attendant approached from the galley, sensing a potential issue. "Is everything all right?" the lead attendant asked, looking between Melissa and Elaine. "Everything's fine," Elaine said calmly. "I was just introducing myself to Melissa. I'm Elaine Johnson." Recognition dawned immediately on the lead attendant's face. "Ms. Johnson, I had no idea you were on this flight. We weren't notified about any VIP passengers today." "That was intentional," Elaine explained. "I wanted to experience our service as a regular passenger would." The atmosphere in the cabin shifted instantly. The remaining crew members straightened their posture, and Melissa looked as if she might be sick. The few stragglers still deplaning watched the scene with curious eyes, sensing drama unfolding. "Ms. Johnson, I can explain," Melissa began, her voice barely above a whisper. Elaine held up a hand. "This isn't the time or place for that conversation." She kept her tone professional but firm. "I'd like to speak with the entire crew, but not here. Is there a conference room or office we could use at the airport?" The lead attendant nodded quickly. "Yes, of course, we can use the crew briefing room. It should be empty right now." "Perfect, I'll meet you all there in 20 minutes. That should give everyone time to complete their post-flight duties." With that, Elaine turned and exited the plane, leaving behind a crew in various states of shock. As she walked up the jetway, she could hear the hushed, urgent whispers behind her, no doubt as Melissa explained to her colleagues what had just happened. In the terminal, Elaine found a quiet corner and pulled out her phone. She had several missed calls and messages from her assistant, wondering why she wasn't responding to urgent emails. Elaine sent a quick text explaining that she'd been on a flight and would call soon, then made her way toward the Horizon Airlines operations area. The Chicago station manager, Thomas Chen, was surprised to see her walk into his office unannounced. He jumped to his feet, straightening his tie nervously. "Ms. Johnson, we weren't expecting you until tomorrow's meeting." "That was the plan," Elaine said with a slight smile. "But I decided to come in early and take one of our flights as a regular passenger. I've just arrived on flight 862 from Newark." Understanding dawned on Thomas's face. "Ah, I see. An undercover boss situation?" "Something like that. I need to borrow your conference room for a meeting with the flight crew in about 15 minutes. "Of course, no problem. Would you like me to sit in?" Elaine considered this. "No, but I'd like to meet with you afterward to discuss my observations." While waiting for the crew to arrive, Elaine reviewed her notes and gathered her thoughts. She wasn't interested in punishing Melissa. Public humiliation rarely led to genuine change. Instead, she wanted to use this experience as a teaching moment, not just for this crew, but for the entire airline. One by one, the flight attendants filed into the conference room, looking nervous. Melissa entered last, her face pale and her hands visibly shaking. They sat around the table, an uncomfortable silence filling the room until Elaine spoke. "First, I want to thank you all for the work you do every day," she began, surprising them with her positive tone. "Flying can be stressful for passengers, and you're on the front lines making sure they have a safe and comfortable experience. That's no small task." Some of the tension in the room eased slightly, though Melissa still looked like she might bolt for the door at any moment. "I flew on our airline today not to catch anyone doing something wrong," Elaine continued, "but to understand the reality of our service from a passenger's perspective. What I experienced was educational." She turned to Kelly. "I noticed that you made a point of connecting with passengers, learning names, anticipating needs, showing genuine care for a mother traveling with a young child. That's exactly the kind of service we want to be known for." Kelly's cheeks flushed with pride. "Thank you, Ms. Johnson. I just try to treat people the way I'd want my family to be treated." "That's a perfect philosophy for customer service," Elaine said warmly before turning her attention to Melissa, who seemed to shrink in her chair. "Melissa, I heard your comments about me during the flight," Elaine said directly but without anger. "About how I didn't look like I could afford business class, about how someone like me shouldn't worry about corporate policies. The other flight attendants shifted uncomfortably in their seats, a few shooting surprised glances at Melissa. "I'm not here to embarrass or punish you," Elaine continued, "but I want to understand why you felt it was appropriate to make judgments about a passenger based on their appearance." Melissa's eyes filled with tears. "Ms. Johnson, I am so sorry. I had no idea who you were." "That's precisely the point," Elaine interrupted gently. "You shouldn't treat anyone differently based on who you think they are or aren't. Every passenger on our planes deserves the same level of respect and care, regardless of what they're wearing or what cabin they're sitting in." Melissa nodded miserably. "You're right. There's no excuse for my behavior." "I'm not looking for excuses," Elaine said. "I'm looking for understanding. Help me understand why a professional like yourself, with 8 years of experience, would speak about a passenger that way." There was a long pause as Melissa struggled to find words. Finally, she took a deep breath. "Honestly, I'm tired, I'm burned out. We're all overworked and underpaid. The company keeps cutting our benefits while expecting us to smile through everything. Passenger complaints go up and we get blamed, even though we have no control over the delays or the baggage fees or any of the other things people get upset about." The other flight attendants nodded in agreement, and Elaine could see this was a sentiment shared by many. "So you take it out on the passengers?" Elaine asked, not accusingly but with genuine curiosity. "No, I mean I shouldn't. And usually I don't. Not to their faces anyway." Melissa wiped at her eyes. "But sometimes, yes, I guess I do. Especially the ones who seem like they won't complain or cause problems for me. It's wrong. I know it's wrong." Elaine nodded slowly, taking this in. The problem was deeper than she'd thought, not just individual attitudes but systemic issues affecting morale and, by extension, customer service. "Thank you for your honesty," she said. "That's exactly what I needed to hear." She looked around at the entire crew. "I'm not going to pretend I can fix all the problems at Horizon overnight, but I want you to know that I see you, I hear you, and I'm committed to making things better, not just for our passengers but for our employees too." She turned back to Melissa. "As for what happened today, I don't. believe in public shaming or making examples of people. What I do believe in is learning and growth. So here's what I propose. Rather than any disciplinary action, I'd like you to help develop a new training program for our crew members, focused on unconscious bias and customer experience. Your perspective would be valuable, and it might help others avoid similar mistakes. Melissa looked up in surprise. You want my help? I do. Sometimes the people who understand a problem best are the ones who've been part of it. For the first time, Melissa's expression showed something other than fear or shame, a glimmer of hope, perhaps even determination. I'd like that opportunity, she said quietly. I really would, Elaine smiled. Good. We'll set something up when I'm back at headquarters. She stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. Thank you all for your time and your candor. This conversation has given me a lot to think about. As the crew filed out, Melissa lingered behind. Miss Johnson, she said hesitantly, I truly am sorry. What I said was inexcusable regardless of the circumstances. Elaine regarded her thoughtfully. You know, Melissa, early in my career, I was often the only black woman in the room during executive meetings. I can't count the number of times people assumed I was there to take notes or serve coffee, not to make decisions. So I understand, perhaps better than most, what it feels like to be judged by appearances. Melissa looked down, clearly ashamed. But here's what I learned, Elaine continued. We all have biases. The question is what we do about them. Do we let them control our behavior? Or do we recognize them and work to overcome them? That's the choice each of us makes every day. I want to make better choices, Melissa said softly. That's all any of us can do, Elaine replied. And it starts with awareness. You're already taking that first step. As Melissa left the room, Elaine remained seated, processing everything that had happened. What had started as a simple undercover exercise had revealed layers of issues within her airline. Employee burnout, a disconnect between corporate and frontline staff, inconsistent customer service, and perhaps most troubling, a culture that sometimes allowed prejudice to affect how passengers were treated. But she'd also seen signs of hope, in Kelly's natural empathy, in Melissa's willingness to acknowledge her mistakes, in the crew's honest feedback when given the chance to speak freely. Elaine pulled out her phone and opened her calendar. She had meetings scheduled for the rest of the day with the Chicago management team, but her mind was already racing ahead to the larger changes that needed to happen across the entire airline. This experience had given her a clearer vision of both the problems and the potential solutions. As she gathered her things to leave the conference room, Elaine felt a renewed sense of purpose. Turning Horizon Airlines around would be challenging, but now she had seen firsthand what needed to change, and where to begin. The news spread quickly throughout Horizon Airlines. By the time Elaine returned to headquarters 3 days later, everyone had heard about the CEO who had flown economy class incognito and confronted a flight attendant who had mocked her. The story had taken on a life of its own, with details exaggerated or invented with each retelling. Some versions claimed Elaine had fired the entire crew on the spot. Others suggested she had sued the flight attendant for discrimination. The most dramatic rendition had Elaine standing up mid-flight to announce her identity over the intercom, causing Melissa to faint in the aisle. None of these stories were true, of course, but Elaine wasn't surprised by the gossip. A company was like a small town. News traveled fast, and people loved drama. What did surprise her was finding Melissa waiting outside her office on Thursday morning. Ms. Johnson, Melissa said, rising from her seat as Elaine approached. Thank you for seeing me. I know you must be incredibly busy. Elaine hadn't actually scheduled this meeting, but she gestured for Melissa to follow her into the office anyway. Come in. What brings you to headquarters? Melissa took a seat across from Elaine's desk, her posture stiff with anxiety. I wanted to speak with you directly, not just through HR. The rumors going around, they're pretty wild. I've heard some of them, Elaine said with a wry smile. Apparently I made quite a scene on the plane. Exactly, Melissa said, relief evident in her voice that Elaine understood. People are saying I'm going to be fired or demoted, or that you're using me as an example in some big company-wide announcement about discrimination. And you're worried about your job. Yes. But I'm also worried about becoming infamous, I guess. The flight attendant who insulted the CEO. I've worked hard for 8 years and I made one terrible mistake. I don't want that to define my entire career. Elaine studied Melissa thoughtfully. The woman sitting before her today looked different from the flight attendant who had dismissed her on the plane. Humbled, certainly, but there was something else. A determination in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "I meant what I said in Chicago," Elaine said finally. "I'm not interested in public shaming or making an example of you. What happened on that flight stays between us and the crew as far as I'm concerned." Melissa's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Thank you. I appreciate that more than I can say. However," Elaine continued, "I was serious about wanting your help with a new training initiative. In fact, that's become even more important to me after my meetings in Chicago." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the airport in the distance. "During those 3 days, I spoke with dozens of employees, gate agents, baggage handlers, customer service reps, pilots, and I heard the same concerns over and over. Burnout, feeling undervalued, disconnect from management. These aren't just your personal issues. They're systemic problems affecting our entire workforce." Turning back to Melissa, she continued, "And those problems directly impact how our employees treat our customers. It's all connected. So what are you planning to do?" Melissa asked, curiosity overtaking her anxiety. Elaine returned to her desk and pulled out a folder. "I'm calling it the Horizon Reset. It's a comprehensive program to rebuild our company culture from the ground up. And I'd like you to be part of the team that helps develop it." Melissa blinked in surprise. "Me? But why would you want—" "Because you've shown me something valuable," Elaine interrupted. "You made a mistake, yes. But more importantly, you owned it. You didn't make excuses or try to downplay what happened. That takes courage and integrity, qualities we need more of at Horizon." She slid the folder across the desk. "This is just an outline of what I'm thinking. A series of workshops and training sessions for all customer-facing staff, led by a team that includes frontline employees, not just HR consultants or executives who haven't worked with customers in years." Melissa opened the folder and scanned the first page. "Unconscious bias training, empathy building, customer journey mapping." She looked up at Elaine. "This is actually really good. The key is that it can't just be theoretical," Elaine explained. "We need real-world experiences and perspectives. That's where you come in. I want you to share your story, not to embarrass you, but because it's powerful. It shows how easy it is for all of us to make judgments based on appearances, and how those judgments affect our behavior." For a long moment, Melissa didn't respond, just continued reading through the proposal. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. "When I was in training 8 years ago, I was so excited to become a flight attendant. I had these ideals about helping people and making their journey special, but somewhere along the way I lost that. The job became routine, passengers became annoyances rather than people." She closed the folder. "If sharing my experience can help others avoid that trap, I want to do it." Elaine smiled, pleasantly surprised by Melissa's willingness. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say. But there's one condition." "What's that?" "Your participation in this program needs to be completely voluntary. I won't require it as some form of punishment or atonement. If you do this, it should be because you genuinely want to help create positive change." Melissa didn't hesitate. "I do want that. I've been thinking about our conversation nonstop since Chicago. About how I let myself become the kind of person who would judge someone based on their clothes or what cabin they were sitting in." She shook her head. "That's not who I want to be." "Good," Elaine said, standing to indicate the meeting was concluding. "My team will contact you with the details. We're aiming to launch the first workshop in 3 weeks." As Melissa rose to leave, she paused at the door. "Ms. Johnson, there's something else I wanted to say." "Thank you for not firing me. Most executives would have." "Most executives haven't been in my shoes," Elaine replied, "both literally and figuratively. Sometimes people deserve a second chance, especially when they're brave enough to admit they were wrong." After Melissa left, Elaine's assistant buzzed to remind her about the executive team meeting starting in 5 minutes. She gathered her notes and headed to the conference room, where the company's senior leadership was already assembling. These were the people who would need to fully support the Horizon Reset if it was going to succeed. As Elaine took her place at the head of the table, she could feel the curiosity in the room. Everyone had heard something about her undercover flight, but few knew the details or what she planned to do about it. "Before we get to the agenda," Elaine began, I want to tell you about my flight to Chicago last week. For the next 15 minutes, she shared the experience, not just Melissa's comments, but everything she had observed about the inconsistent service, the clear distinctions between how different passengers were treated, and most importantly, what she had learned in her conversations with staff afterward. The bottom line is this, she concluded. We have a culture problem at Horizon, and it's affecting every aspect of our business, from customer satisfaction to employee retention to our bottom line. Today I want to present a plan to address it. The COO, David Wong, leaned forward. Culture change initiatives can be expensive and time-consuming, Elaine, and the results are often hard to measure. The board is looking for quick improvements in our numbers. I understand that, Elaine replied, but I believe this is the most direct path to those improvements. Our customer satisfaction scores have been declining for 3 years. Our employee turnover is at an all-time high. These aren't separate problems, they're symptoms of the same underlying issue. And what issue is that exactly? Asked the CFO, Lucia Rivera. A disconnect between our stated values and our actual behaviors, Elaine said simply. We say we value every customer, but we treat them differently based on what cabin they're in or how they're dressed. We say we value our employees, but we cut their benefits while expecting more from them. We say we're one company, but there's a huge divide between headquarters and frontline staff. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. These were hard truths, and Elaine could see from the executives' faces that they knew she was right. So what's your plan? David asked finally. Elaine outlined the Horizon Reset program, emphasizing that it wasn't just about training but about fundamentally changing how they operated as a company. She explained how frontline employees like Melissa would help lead the initiative, sharing real experiences to make the training meaningful and authentic. When she finished, there was a thoughtful silence before Lucia spoke. It's ambitious, I'll give you that, but I'm concerned about the costs, especially with the board watching our expenses so closely. I've run the numbers, Elaine said, sliding copies of a budget across the table. The program will cost approximately $2 million over 6 months. That's less than 1% of what we're currently losing annually due to customer churn and employee turnover. And you're confident this will move the needle on those issues? David asked. I am, Elaine said firmly, but I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I'm proposing we pilot the program with 3 of our worst performing stations first. If we see improvement in their metrics after 3 months, we roll it out company-wide. If not, we reevaluate. The discussion continued for another hour, with executives raising concerns and Elaine addressing them one by one. By the end, she had what she needed: tentative buy-in from the senior leadership team, with the understanding that they would present a united front to the board. As the meeting concluded and people began filtering out, David lingered behind. Bold move going undercover like that, he said. Most new CEOs would be focused on impressing the board, not riding in economy class to check on the troops. I've found that understanding the reality on the ground is the best way to make effective decisions at the top, Elaine replied, gathering her papers. David nodded thoughtfully. For what it's worth, I think your approach is exactly what Horizon needs right now. We've been coasting for too long, pretending our problems would fix themselves. He paused. But the board won't be as easy to convince as we were. They're looking for quick fixes and immediate returns. Then we'll need to help them understand that some problems don't have quick fixes, Elaine said, and that investing in our people and our culture now will pay dividends for years to come. As she walked back to her office, Elaine felt both the weight of the challenge ahead and a sense of purpose that energized her. Changing a company's culture was never easy or quick, but she was convinced it was necessary not just for Horizon's bottom line, but for every employee who came to work each day and every passenger who chose to fly with them. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her assistant. Board presentation scheduled for Tuesday at 10 a.m. All members confirmed attendance. 6 days to prepare the most important presentation of her career. 6 days to convince the board that the path forward wasn't just cost-cutting and quick fixes, but a fundamental reset of how Horizon Airlines operated. Elaine sat at her desk and opened her laptop, ready to begin the work. The encounter with Melissa had been uncomfortable, even painful, but it had provided the clarity she needed about what was wrong at Horizon and how to fix it. Sometimes, Elaine reflected, the most valuable insights came from the most unexpected places, like a chance encounter at 30,000 feet with someone who saw you as less than you were. Now it was time to turn that insight into action. 6 months later, Elaine stood at the podium in the company's largest conference room, looking out at the gathered employees. The quarterly all-hands meeting had once been a dreaded event, with lackluster attendance and a palpable sense of apathy. Today, the room was packed, with additional employees joining via video conference from stations across the country. Before I share our quarterly results, Elaine began, I want to reflect on the journey we've been on these past 6 months. When I became your CEO, I promised transparency and a new direction for Horizon Airlines. Today, I want to show you where that new direction has taken us. She clicked to the first slide, which showed customer satisfaction scores trending sharply upward over the past 2 quarters. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. For the first time in 3 years, our customer satisfaction scores have increased for 6 consecutive months, Elaine announced. We're not at the top of the industry yet, but we've moved from 9th place to 5th among major carriers. That's significant progress in a short time. The next slide showed employee retention rates also improving steadily. Our employee turnover has decreased by 22%, Elaine continued. Put simply, fewer of you are leaving, and according to our internal surveys, more of you are feeling engaged and valued in your work. That matters, not just to our bottom line, but to who we are as a company. As she cycled through the presentation, highlighting various metrics that showed Horizon's improvement, Elaine couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The board had been skeptical of her Horizon Reset program, agreeing to it only with strict performance conditions and a tight timeline. Today's results had silenced even the most doubtful directors. Now I want to be clear, Elaine said, setting aside her clicker. We still have work to do. Our on-time performance needs improvement. Our baggage handling metrics, while better, are not yet where they should be. And we're still hearing that communication between departments could be more effective. She stepped away from the podium, preferring to speak more directly to the employees. But what these results show is that we're on the right track. The changes we've made, from the frontline staff training programs to the new feedback systems to the revised compensation structures, they're working. And they're working because you've embraced them. From her position at the front of the room, Elaine could see Melissa sitting in the 3rd row. No longer just a flight attendant, Melissa had become one of the key facilitators of the Horizon Reset program, sharing her story with hundreds of employees across the company. Her willingness to be vulnerable about her mistakes had made the training sessions more impactful than any corporate PowerPoint presentation could have been. After the initial workshop series, Melissa had approached Elaine with an idea for a more comprehensive program, one that would pair executives with frontline staff for regular in-the-trenches days. The program, which they had dubbed Walk in Their Shoes, was now being rolled out across the company, with executives working alongside gate agents, baggage handlers, and yes, flight attendants, to better understand the day-to-day challenges they faced. I want to share one more piece of news before I open the floor for questions, Elaine said. Starting next month, we're expanding our employee recognition program. The new Above and Beyond Awards will celebrate staff who exemplify our core values, with quarterly winners receiving not just recognition, but also tangible rewards, additional paid time off, travel vouchers for their families, and a $2,000 bonus. This announcement was met with enthusiastic applause. Employee recognition had been one of the top requests in the company surveys, with many staff feeling that their extra efforts often went unnoticed by management. The nominations will come from peers and from customers, Elaine explained once the applause died down. Because who better to identify exceptional service than the people who witness it every day? As the meeting transitioned to the Q&A portion, Elaine fielded questions on everything from route expansions to the new crew scheduling system. The tone was different from her first all-hands 6 months ago, less confrontational, more collaborative. Employees weren't just asking what management was going to fix. They were offering suggestions and solutions of their own. When the meeting concluded, Elaine found herself surrounded by staff eager to share their experiences with the new initiatives. She made time for each of them, listening attentively to their feedback, both positive and critical. This was one of the changes she had implemented in her own leadership style, being accessible, truly hearing what employees had to say, not just rushing from one executive meeting to the next. As the crowd thinned, Melissa approached, looking more confident than Elaine had ever seen her. Great meeting, Melissa said. The energy in the room was so different from when I started facilitating these workshops. It's a remarkable shift, Elaine agreed. And you've been a big part of that change. The feedback on your sessions has been overwhelmingly positive. Melissa smiled, but there was a hint of something else in her expression, perhaps uncertainty. Actually, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. I've been thinking about what comes next for me. Oh? Elaine said, curious. What are you thinking? I love the training work I've been doing, but I also miss flying sometimes. The connections with passengers, the travel. She hesitated. I've been wondering if there might be a way to do both. Maybe split my time between training and flying. Or develop some kind of mentorship program for new hires that I could lead while still keeping my flight status. Elaine considered this for a moment. That's an interesting idea. We've been discussing how to sustain the momentum of these changes once the initial program ends. A mentorship system could be exactly what we need. She made a note on her tablet. Let's set up a proper meeting to discuss it next week. Bring your ideas and we'll see what we can develop. Melissa's face lit up. Thank you. I'll put together a proposal. As Melissa walked away, Elaine was struck by the transformation in her. 6 months ago, this was a burned-out flight attendant who had lost her connection to the purpose of her job. Today, she was enthusiastically developing new programs and thinking about how to help others succeed. It was perhaps the most tangible example of the culture shift happening throughout Horizon. Elaine gathered her things and headed back to her office, where her executive assistant, Lynn, was waiting with an update on her schedule. The media interview has been confirmed for 3 p.m., Lynn said, handing Elaine a briefing document. They're particularly interested in the employee-led aspects of the turnaround. Also, the latest passenger numbers came in. We're up 4% year over year for the first time since 2020. That's excellent news, Elaine said, scanning the briefing. Any word from the board about the expansion proposal? Just got the email, Lynn replied with a smile. They've approved it unanimously. You've got the green light for the new routes and the additional aircraft. This was the final piece of good news Elaine had been waiting for. When she had first presented her vision to the board, they had agreed to the cultural initiatives but had put the expansion plans on hold until they saw concrete results. Today's approval meant they were now fully behind her strategy for Horizon's future. As she settled at her desk to prepare for the interview, Elaine reflected on how far they had come in such a relatively short time. The changes hadn't always been easy. Some longtime managers had resisted the new approach, preferring the old top-down style of leadership. A few had even left the company rather than adapt. But the majority had embraced the reset, recognizing that it was not just good for morale but good for business. The interview that afternoon focused mainly on Horizon's remarkable turnaround, with the reporter particularly interested in the story of how it all began. I understand there was a specific incident that sparked these changes, the reporter said. Something about you flying incognito on one of your own planes. Elaine smiled. The story had become something of a legend within the company, though few outside knew the full details. Yes, shortly after becoming CEO, I decided to experience our service as a regular passenger would. It was enlightening. Can you elaborate? The reporter pressed. Let's just say I gained some valuable insights into both our customer experience and our company culture, Elaine replied diplomatically. It helped me identify areas where we weren't living up to our potential. And the flight attendant who allegedly didn't recognize you, is it true she still works for the airline? Elaine's expression remained neutral, though internally she sighed at the reporter's focus on the gossipy aspects of the story. We have many dedicated flight attendants at Horizon, all of whom contribute to our success in different ways. What I think is more significant is how our employees at every level have embraced the changes we've implemented. That's the real story here. The reporter seemed to get the message and moved on to questions about the financial implications of the turnaround. By the end of the interview, the focus had shifted to where Elaine wanted it, on the collaborative effort that had transformed Horizon, not on one uncomfortable moment that had catalyzed it. Later that evening, as Elaine prepared to head home, Lynn appeared in her doorway with an envelope. This just came for you. Melissa asked me to make sure you got it before you left. Curious, Elaine opened the envelope to find a handwritten note and a photograph. The note read, Ms. Johnson, today marks exactly 6 months since that flight to Chicago. I wanted to share something with you. This is a photo from last week's graduation ceremony for our newest class of flight attendants. I had the honor of being their final instructor, sharing what I've learned about creating genuine connections with passengers. When you gave me a second chance, you changed the course of my career and my life. I hope I'm doing the same for these new hires, teaching them to see the humanity in every passenger, regardless of how they're dressed or where they're seated. With gratitude, Melissa. The photograph showed Melissa standing with a group of smiling new flight attendants, all of them looking proud and excited to begin their careers. Elaine tucked the note and photo into her bag, oddly moved by the gesture. In all her years in corporate leadership, few moments had felt as rewarding as seeing the ripple effects of that difficult, but ultimately transformative encounter at 30,000 feet. As she left the office and headed to the parking garage, Elaine found herself thinking about her next flight. Since that day 6 months ago, she had made it a practice to regularly fly as a normal passenger, sometimes in business class but often in economy, always without announcement or special treatment. It wasn't just about monitoring service quality, though that was part of it, but about maintaining her connection to the core of what Horizon Airlines was, a company that transported human beings from place to place, with all the responsibility that entailed. Tomorrow she would board another Horizon flight, this time to Boston for an industry conference. She would check in online, wait in the regular security line, and find her seat like any other passenger. Maybe the crew would recognize her, maybe they wouldn't. But either way, she knew the experience would be different from that first undercover flight. Not because she was now known as the CEO, but because Horizon itself was different. They were becoming the airline she had always believed they could be. One where every passenger was valued, regardless of appearance or status. As Elaine drove home through the fading light, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The journey was far from over. Culture change was never truly complete, but they had turned an important corner. What had begun with an uncomfortable moment of bias had transformed into an opportunity for growth that had benefited not just one flight attendant, not just one CEO, but an entire company. Sometimes, Elaine reflected, the most powerful changes began in the most unexpected ways, with a misunderstanding, a moment of judgment, and the courage to face uncomfortable truths. In the case of Horizon Airlines, that moment at 30,000 feet had been the catalyst for a transformation that was now carrying them to new heights, one flight at a time.